Hello, Lulie. How are you doing?
Doing good. How about you?
I'm doing really well, thanks. Good to see you. It's been some time.
Yeah, it has. Are you in Bali right now?
I am in Bali. I have another 3 months or so here, then going who knows where. It's pretty nice.
I'm very jealous.
Thank you, thank you. So we are here to talk about ostensibly Alexander Technique and View, which is something that everyone who has had some taste of Alexander Technique and View has been like, there's something similar here. There's a thing going on here that is worth talking about. And since you've done Art of Accomplishment and you've just got back from an Alexander Technique conference or congress, thought it would be good to just chat about that. So, for the benefit of those who might not know who you are, since it's going on my YouTube channel, who are you in however many words you want to say, and how did you come to Alexander Technique as well?
Well, to answer the last question, that's your fault, as it is for most of these people on Twitter. So, I'm Lulie. I live in Oxford. I've been in teacher training for Alexander Technique since last October, so almost a year. I first discovered it in 2020 because someone replied to one of my tweets and said, Lulie, stop what you're doing. Go read these tweets by Michael Ashcroft. You'll thank me later. Just go and do it. And like, it was a very kind of hard sell. And I was like, well, why not? Like, let's give this a go. And I tried some of the exercises that you had, and I immediately got like very strong effects. Even though this was in lockdown, there was no like in-person teacher. It was just like tweets, just text. And so like I thought like, wow, this really seems like this thing that I've been looking for so long. And so I was kind of hooked basically from that. And then I went to go and see your teacher, Peter Nobes, who's now my teacher. And yeah, so I've just gone to the AT Congress. And then with the View stuff, with the Art of Accomplishment, so I did the connection course, I want to say August of last year. So I started them both at the same time, which actually makes it difficult for me to parse out which stuff was Art of Accomplishment and which stuff I got from Alexander Technique. But I feel like they combine extremely well. And then I've done the connection course like a bunch of times, like I think like 6 times or something, and then I did also the masterclass in the summer.
Hmm. Amazing. For those as well who are maybe not so familiar with what View is, I've done the connection course once, and I've listened to a bunch of Joe's podcasts, but you're way beyond me. So can you give like a nutshell version of what View is?
So, View is a state of mind and a kind of an approach to it's kind of like to navigating both your emotions, to connection with people, and to kind of life more broadly. It's one of these things that's quite difficult to describe, just like Alexander Technique is quite difficult to describe. View stands for vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder. And it turns out when you have each of these things, it kind of causes magical effects where I say magical, I mean like it causes deep connection. It allows you to have like really deep conversations with people. It allows you to be with yourself. It kind of brings you back to like what's actually real for me. And yeah, for me it just makes life better in general.
Life better in general. I'd love to dig into that a bit more because that's kind of how I would articulate Alexander Technique as well. It's like it turns up the gain on the world, it makes things kind of easier and just somehow better. And the articulation of this is often annoyingly vague. I guess I'm curious, like, what have you found is better since you've taken, or since you've dived into Joe's work?
To Joe's work. So for me, I think a lot of it is being with emotions that previously I would either like suppress or feel uncomfortable about or not know how to deal with or something like that. Like so Alexander Technique kind of turns up like almost like the texture of everything. Like it kind of it makes you sort of vividly present. And then the for the View stuff, it kind of um one of the things is that it unblocks areas that might be kind of difficult otherwise. So with Alexander Technique, yes, you've got all this space, but then if a trigger comes up, then like you have to kind of learn how to deal with that. And View is then a kind of a specific way to deal with some triggers, I think. yeah, I could rant on this for a long time, but I'll let you.
Well, I mean, ranting is good. And just for some context as well, again, for those watching, like, this is not meant to be a podcast. It's meant to be more of a conversation. So, like, if you want to just, like, ask me stuff and go off on a 10-minute rant, that's totally okay. This is not, like, polished stuff for podcasty audience. They'll survive. They'll watch till the end, I'm sure, or they won't if they don't want to. It's fine.
Yeah. What was your experience with Vue? What caused this conversation to happen as well?
I think it's a couple of things. So I remember a while ago, I saw a tweet from Charlie Smart on Twitter, who is an Alexander Technique trainee, same place in London. And she had this like map of Alexander Technique, Vue, and something else, and kind of arrows and things pointing. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, that there's this other thing. And I've heard so many people talking about Vue and Joe's work, you in particular and others, just saying like, this is the most important thing I've ever found. Like, this is so powerful. Everyone needs to learn this. And I'm like, okay, And after enough cajoling, essentially, or kind of seeing these things happening, I thought, okay, let me take the connection course with my partner. And we did. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, this Vue state of mind, this place that you go that is Vue seems remarkably similar to the thing that we land in Alexander Technique. And that's just interesting to me. There are very few things that I've come across where I'm like, oh, this is the same thing. And I'm always interested to dissect what are the reasons behind why this is the same as that? What are the underlying factors causing these things to be the same expression or different expressions of the same thing? So I guess when I took Connection course, I was struck by how, so the I is impartiality, and I kind of realized that Alexander Technique is a tool for becoming impartial almost. And I think you can apply it to all of the four of them, but inhibition in the AT language is a way of going, oh, look, I'm partial. Can I undo that? Can I stop being partial and simply allow things to be as they are? So that's one way.
Becoming impartial via wonder.
Yes.
Like via the, like, wow.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, AT is, I kind of want to say like each of the four things in Vue, so vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder, it's almost like Alexander Technique gave me the tool to access each one of those via its opposite. So vulnerability, I could inhibit doing guardedness. With impartiality, I could inhibit partiality. With AT, I could, with empathy would be blending myself with the other person or not allowing myself to connect, so I could let go of that process. And wonder is, I guess, I could inhibit the needing to know the answer, as Joe puts it. So wonder is curiosity without needing to know the answer. And it just felt like Alexander Technique gave me a way in that made Vue make immediate sense. I'm sure it makes immediate sense to other people as well, but it's like, oh, okay, this just fits really perfectly into the thing I know already. And that struck me as beautiful, actually.
Yeah, with the wonder, let's see, what's my experience of it? It's like if you're kind of in wonder about the world, you're not doing this end gaining thing. It's like you're not trying to be somewhere that you're not. You're just like, oh wow, like this is the kind of the present experience. Another thing you said about the empathy, so that's really interesting to me because one of the comments that I got the most from Peter when I was learning Alexander Technique is take charge of yourself. And there was the way that I used to do empathy was to just kind of fall into the other person and just sort of like, I would be like a sponge for their experience. And I would then kind of not be there. Like I would be taking myself away from my own experience. And so it was kind of like, I learned how to do it both from the Art of Accomplishment stuff, which is empathy being defined as like being able to feel someone else with while still feeling yourself. And then that was like the same thing as the like, okay, take charge of yourself, but don't like be cut off from the rest of the world or from your teaching partner or whatever.
I love that.
Yeah, there was also a thing. So, I mean, this might be just like a kind of more body focused Alexander Technique, but like in the Vue connection course, there's a lot of eye contact, like a lot of like eye gazing kind of things. And I discovered from doing that a kind of this sort of soft gaze way of looking at people where it's not like I'm kind of like, you know, collapsed awareness and whatever. It's more like, look, there's a person, I can see their whole face. I'm not like kind of collapsed down. And then in Alexander Technique, there was a visiting teacher or something, and they described like the kind of the way of looking from behind. Okay, so it's like your optic nerve goes to the back of your head or something, and if you
Yeah.
imagine yourself looking from that place, then you have this sort of softer gaze. And I was like, oh, I remember this from View. Like that was the same kind of look that I had there. And I don't know if everyone kind of like discovered that through doing that, but that was a thing that I kind of picked up naturally from doing the connection course.
The eye contact thing is interesting because, yeah, there's a lot of eye gazing in View. Not just eye gazing, but kind of they encourage you to stay in the vividness of the experience by not breaking eye contact almost. And I remember in AT training, there's a lot of eye contact there. So you engage people with eye contact, and we're much more comfortable, I think, than normal outside the training humans in just in holding eye contact and using it as a communication tool. But I think in both settings, you have to learn how to not make it aggressive, almost. As you're saying, this back of the head thing, or giving the person space, or some element of being there with them such that you're not imposing yourself on them at the same time, which is that collapsed awareness you were talking about. This was never made explicit in View, but I could see the demo people doing it. They weren't kind of really there with the camera. It's like they were just naturally able to give their conversational partner the space they needed while still being very present at the same time. It just arrived naturally from the View thing somehow.
I really like the demo videos. This is an aside, but I think they like just it's modeling. That's another thing, another kind of connection. So in Alexander Technique, we know extremely well that we are modeling like whatever the state is, and I think the demo videos give that. And if it were just the exercises, I don't think it would be half as powerful. Because I mean, I don't know. At least for me, like I'm trying to model like whatever the demo video people are doing.
Yeah.
I don't know how you find that.
I think so. I think this is partly why I have, another aside. Alexander himself was talking about how you have to go and see a teacher. This stuff is all like, go and see someone. Books can't communicate this thing. But people often complain to Alexander that they can't learn the thing from the books. And I can understand why from that there was a general view among AT teacher land that you have to do it in person. But that didn't account for the rise of high quality audio and video via the internet, where you can actually communicate or you can convey that modeling thing in a way that didn't exist in Alexander's time in the 20s and 30s. So seeing people do it in the View setting, in the connection course, modeling this state of mind, and it's important because like View is a state of mind. It's not a thing that you do. It's a way of being, and that way of being can be communicated and modeled via video. It's not the stuff they're saying. It's their entire vibe, if you like. And I found that, really powerful.
How much do you pick up Alexander Technique stuff from video? Like compared with in person or touch?
As in if I'm in a teaching context and looking out for...
As in if you're learning from like I've been looking at a bunch of Alexander Technique videos on YouTube, and I can pick up a certain amount, but there's a kind of an extra oomph that you get from the hands-on.
Yeah, totally. So I can pick up quite a lot from the videos. At this point, when let's say watching first lesson from say Anthony Kingsley you sent over, at this point I'm kind of looking to see what he's doing in training context, in teaching, rather than putting myself in the position of the student. So I'm not kind of modeling what am I getting from his teaching because I'm looking at his teaching as a teacher. That said, though,
Yeah. No, I'll finish your thought.
I guess I was just going to say, I have had many experiences of looking at teachers and teaching contexts on YouTube or wherever and getting an experience, and Zoom calls as well. I remember during lockdown, I attended a few of the Zoom sessions that Peter was running because we couldn't do things in person. And I got a lot from that. It's amazing how much you can get from a Zoom context. Obviously, the extra oomph that comes from the hands-on, you can't replicate some of that. but I have been impressed by how much you can replicate.
Yeah, I guess I have an overall question of which media can you actually get Alexander technique from, and to what extent? Like, I got a lot just from your text tweets. And
Yeah.
then, I got I also get a lot from the Zoom calls, and
Mm.
especially if it's an interactive thing where the teacher can point out, like, oh, where have you gone, or like, okay, now take charge of the group, or
Mm.
whatever. And then touches are sort of another thing. And so, and then I also wonder, because so in Alexander technique, there's kind of like two modes of going about it. There's the kind of David Gorman, Peter Knobe sort of like expanded awareness, and then, like, the you'll sort yourself out eventually. Like that will kind of like spark a sort of a global organization.
Mm.
And then there are the kind of the more, like, traditional or stat people, or Anthony Kingsley, and that's more kind of like, talking about particular body parts and sort of, table work and chair work and everything, and that can help. So and then so you do the body stuff, and then the mind stuff follows, and then you get this
Yeah.
kind of peace and presence and whatever. Like, if you watch the Kingsley video, he'll do all of this stuff, and, like, soften knees and whatever
Mm.
and whatever, and then at the end he'll say, so, what's the quality of your mind? And they'll say, it's, calm, and it has all of these properties. And so, and both of them are kind of like, they're both kind of going towards the same thing via this other method. And they're both faster at doing a particular thing. So
Mm.
if you want to, like, sort out your shoulders or something, um and if it's very stubborn, then I could imagine, I mean, I don't know, I'm still fairly new in my journey, so, maybe this is wrong, but I could imagine that having more direct, like, releasing of those specific
Mm.
muscles could help with that particular problem. Whereas with the kind of global thing, like, you'll make faster progress in general, but, like, parts that kind of like don't want to join in, like if you've got this thing and it's just kind of quite like reluctant to kind of get connected,
Mm.
um like that will, like, take longer. And then, so I'm wondering, with the sort of text versus video versus touch, like, maybe they have different things. So, like,
Mm.
with text, like, one of the benefits was that I did it myself, like, entirely myself, basically. Like, there was no interaction from you didn't probably know I existed at that time. And I went away and I explored and I experimented, and so
Mm.
there was a kind of a way that I got more in a certain way that way. And then with touch, like, on the, like, extreme opposite end, you have, like, I have no idea what happened, I don't think I can replicate that by myself. So yeah, I'm wondering what you think about all that.
Oh, there's so much to say. This is great. One quick comment for anyone watching. Lulie used the acronym STAT, and I want to give some context as to what that is. That is the Society for Teachers, or Society of Teachers of the Alexander Technique in the UK. That is a more traditional end of the spectrum of teaching, and Lulie and I are, or I'm a member of, and you're going to be a member of, Alexander Technique International, which is, I guess, it allows for a broader church of ways in, if you like. It's not quite so traditional, although it includes that as well, just for context. So as you were talking there, there's so much in my mind. I think there's a lot to be said for giving the student the chance to go on their own journey. So as you're saying, with the hands-on thing, there's a sense of the teacher notices something, and then brings about some kind of change to some degree that the student will understand or not. So either they can go in there and involve themselves and something will change, as you were saying, the student's like, something changed, but I couldn't do it myself, or I don't know what happened there. I've had a few of those experiences myself. Or the teacher can kind of notice, hey, I've seen from over here as a teacher that you have these habits and patterns and whatever, and I can interrupt those specifically to you because I can see them, and that will give you a way into change and whatever it might be that you can notice. But the benefit, I think, of, let's say, Peter's style of not particularly hands-on, or not kind of targeted at body areas, or online video, audio stuff, text, is that what it teaches the student is to go and look for themselves and build up the strong foundation a little bit. It's kind of, I think I used an analogy before of Alexander himself started from scratch, essentially. He didn't have his own teacher. He spent a lot of time paying attention and noticing things that he could then learn to stop doing constructively, ultimately. And I analogize it to learning to sail, but first having to figure out how to build the boat in the first place, part by part. When you've got to the point where you have the boat and you're sailing it, you know exactly how the whole thing works. It just took you a very long time. Whereas you could also just be given the sailing boat and say, off you go, have a few days of lessons and off you go. You won't know it as well. And I think there's pedagogical ways in saying, well, I'm going to help you help you to build the boat, but we're starting at the build the boat level, so you can learn from that level of foundation, as opposed to, I'm now going to teach you how to insert sailing metaphor here. I don't know how to sail. So yeah, I think it's just how do you go in and what do you want the student to walk away with, whether it's better posture, better movement or whatever, or whether it's a deep sense of how to notice things that you can relate to differently beyond that. That's my take anyway. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I'm curious which what corresponds to helping them build the boat in Alexander technique.
So I have this talking point that I'm enjoying recently, which is you can only respond to what you notice. So a lot of Alexander technique is noticing something that you may not have noticed before, and then responding to it in a couple of ways. Your habitual way, which often involves emphasizing what you were doing anyway. Alexander says trying is only emphasizing the thing we already know. Or you can learn to respond in a constructive way that allows for other possibilities to happen instead, rather than just emphasizing your habit. Now, the benefit of a teacher in person is that they can point out things that you can notice. Or you might not even notice it yourself. They can just notice it for you almost, and then involve themselves in your coordination and something changes. But going from the helping people build a boat level is saying, these are the kind of places where you might want to look to notice things, if you like. I give you the invitation, the permission, the tools to go off into your world, into your life in different contexts, and be available to notice things. And then the things that show up for noticing are your dojo, if you like. They're the things to work with, because they're the things that are coming up for you gently in your context. A teacher might see things that you wouldn't notice yourself, and that's an extra value, I think, of having a teacher. But it's just a different way of integrating into life, I think.
So what's the value of being given a boat at all? Like if noticing is something that you can always make progress with on yourself, then why get a boat?
It is much faster. I will give them that. So if you...
Is it faster to have the experience, or faster to learn to adjust your baseline of how often you have that experience, or how much you have that experience in day-to-day life?
I think it's faster to... Well, it's, I think, a more reliable way of having an experience that's useful. So when someone, let's say, takes my online course, some people have an extremely strong, immediate, I get this, cool, I understand what this is, brilliant reaction. Other people, and I think they're the ones who just don't say anything after the fact, kind of go like, well, this is weird, and just don't have an experience. Or, to some degree between those two things anyway. And in an in-person lesson, the teacher is much more able to go kind of, oh no, you haven't got it yet, or using touch to increase the likelihood of someone having an experience that is useful. Whereas in, let's say, an asynchronous context, the Zoom context is different because you can see someone responding and you can communicate real time. But again, you've got the spectrum from hands-on in-person, Zoom live, to online course version. The feedback element means that you can more quickly self-correct and go to the ways in that the student would need to have a way in, as opposed to kind of creating a frame that would work for most people most of the time, at least. And then if there is a specific thing that someone wants to work on, like you said, the tight shoulders thing, if someone came to me saying, I have tight shoulders, I'll go, okay, cool. And then ignore that for a lot of the session. And then at the end kind of say, how are your shoulders? But I would still maybe kind of play in that area a little bit, see what's going on, see if I can find something that they're doing or holding, that kind of thing. Whereas, again, in an online context, even in a Zoom context, there's less you can do to address specific things, I think, unless you have a pretty big toolkit focused on body release anatomy stuff.
So it's interesting that there are more things or different things available in Alexander Technique in person, but with Vue, I think this is also the case. Like I think so, Art of Accomplishment also has an in-person workshop where I'm told, I haven't done it, but I'm told that there are different things that are possible for them to get
Huh.
into, and it's more intense. It's kind of and however, like most of the Art of Accomplishment stuff is online in a
Mm.
cohort, and so I don't know. I'm just noting that this is an interesting kind of parallel.
That's something that actually is very interesting about Vue is that they don't have distributed teachers. They get the partnership, the pairing, in at least in the connection course, where you are both, in a sense, playing the teacher and student role at the same time. So you're noticing all the stuff, you're playing with the ideas, and it's sufficiently simple as a frame that you don't need someone to be the teacher, if you like. So it's live in the sense that someone's there with you, but it's also really heavily distributed, which I find really interesting. I'm very fascinated now to hear what they might do in person that they don't do in the online cohorts, because I just, if anyone out there knows what
I think
they do
it's
in
more
person.
emotional release stuff, but I don't know the
uh,
details. But there's stuff like that you can get to a greater level of intensity if you're in person, and there's a kind of safe container and stuff.
okay, I did a tantra course here in Bali, a 2-day tantra weekend, and there was emotional release stuff in that, so I can see why you'd want kind of in-person containers for that. So lots of throwing tantrums, punching the air, like shaking and that kind of thing. And they had like a section on the side saying, if you feel overwhelmed or in some way triggered, just go and lie in the chill out area and one of our like assistants will come over and help you move through it, kind of thing. So I can imagine you might want to avoid going there too much when there's no container to help.
Yeah, I mean, in the masterclass there are also emotional releases, but I imagine that it's sort of just at a more kind of contained level or something like that.
Mm,
Cool.
interesting. So I'm curious about, I think one of the things I was thinking about, or you were thinking about, we exchanged some text messages about this. Almost that Vue gives you some content to work with, in the sense that AT does to an extent. Like I was saying, you can respond to what you notice. That kind of requires you to notice things and then go from there. So it's kind of a self-directed, follow the breadcrumbs type experience with AT. But Vue gives you these four very clear, oh, I'm not being very vulnerable, or oh, I could be more empathetic, or how could I have more wonder in this moment, which I think is a specific way in. I guess, how have you found that experience with the AT training or kind of experience of Vue, not having that kind of content on the AT side, almost, if that's a question that makes any sense at all?
Yeah, it's like the content for AT, at least in our training, is kind of like being present with the world, being
Mm,
present with your environment, the space, and then also the intentions of others and projecting your intentions or something like this. So that's kind of, but it's Vue. Yeah, what is it? It's something like, okay, why do we hold in the first place?
mm,
Why do we like make this face when we think? It's because like school was saying are you paying attention? And so you need to look as if you're thinking.
mm, mm,
Why do we hold in our stomach? Because we want to look attractive, and we're worried that if we don't do that, then we won't look attractive. And AT kind of gets at these things kind of through the back door almost by like saying like, hey, look, you're here now, like there's all of this space and everything, and then you kind of like chill out a bit and then relax those things. And but people can start crying and not know why, like
mm,
because they've released something that happened to be connected to some psychological thing.
mm,
And then Vue is almost like a kind of, you can dive right in or kind of like drill in to what those things are that cause you to have these holdings in the first place. So especially with something like vulnerability, so they define it as speaking your truth despite the consequences, or speaking your truth even if it's scary.
mm,
And And so there's ways like, oh yeah, what is my truth right now? And then you can kind of notice, oh, like I'm not saying this thing because I don't want to offend this person because I'm afraid that that's gonna blah blah blah.
Mm.
And so and by like noticing that and then doing the like kind of actually speaking it or doing like whatever that addresses that fear, then you get the relaxation as well in a certain way. Um, there was someone I met who's done a lot of the art of accomplishment stuff, who is very tall, and
Mm.
most tall people go like this. And so I asked him, like, hey, like, how is it that you don't like smile? You've got really good posture for someone who's
Mm.
that tall. And he said, well, I didn't always. And before he did all of this kind of self work,
Mm.
he did in fact, and he found it sort of naturally kind of righted itself. So they really are kind of quite connected, I think.
Mm. That's interesting. Because I kind of think of AT as the goal is like unfixation. You notice all the ways in which you are fixated, and then you learn to unfixate and for something else to show up instead, almost. But what View does is it gives you an unfixation and then a thing to orient towards in different domains. So it's like, oh, I'm fixatedly guarded right now. Could I first of all unfixate from my guardedness, which is the AT move, but then also go further into, oh, could I move into greater vulnerability at the same time? So it does give you a kind of a directionality in a connection context. And it's fascinating to hear that seems to translate into physical posture as well when it comes to the person who's done other stuff and kind of is now just taller. Because again, it's a kind of like, it's an unfixated, I was shrinking myself, I was kind of guarded, and now I realize I don't need to be. And that's in AT language, a psychophysical process, since there's no such thing as just a physical or just a mental thing, it's all one thing. As you were saying earlier, if you go in via the body, you can say, how's your mental state doing? The other way around works just as well. So it's great to hear that works so clearly in the View context as well.
So just to clarify, I get you right. So it's like you have various habits that kick in when you're in connection with someone or when you're talking to someone, interacting with someone. And then View is a way of like taking those specific ones and then unfixating. And then Alexander technique is kind of getting globally unfixated, and then that can have trickle down effects to like the hang-ups or triggers that you have in connection with people.
I think so. I think the specific AT skill is of noticing all the fixations and then learning to put them down. And this is where it intersects the most with Buddhist practice, I think, in that you realize, let's go back to the View as a context. It's like, I know, I can notice in the moment that I'm attached to the frame that I'm bringing to the conversation, right? So I'm being partial, perhaps. Or I'm fixated to the sense that I really want to know the answer to something. I need to know this thing. And that's like, there's the collapse of awareness almost that comes from I need to know the answer here, which is not wonder, it's something else. So the AT thing is like, oh, look, I'm fixated, put that down. And then, oh, can I allow more wonder? Can I allow more impartiality? And direct that back towards this person. I don't know if they talk about this in the work, in the AOA or the connection course, but going into the View state of mind where the rest of the world is the person or the thing to connect with rather than another human. Oh. Can you be View with a tree and the landscape and the stuff? Because that's kind of what AT points at, is that state of mind all the time, everywhere, everyone, all at once, like whatever it was.
The moment that you said that, like, so I'm looking, you can probably hear the birds tweeting. I'm looking
Indeed.
at this like lovely like trees and everything, and I just suddenly got in connection with all of that. That was nice. Huh. Yeah, I also noticed, so I'm just gonna say this. So I'm finding myself being more like, oh, this is a podcast rather than this is a conversation with Michael.
Yeah.
And well, that's a shame, but like now I've said it, I feel kind of more chill.
Yeah, cool.
like I noticed like all of these kind of habits kicking in, and I feel like the combination of these two things really is the thing that kind of, because like Alexander technique kind of gives me almost like a zooming out in general, and like I can kind of watch myself, and there's a kind of, I can watch like the environment, and I can kind of see like where am I at based on like, you know, how like if I'm in weird things or if I'm like losing track of the environment or whatever.
Yeah.
And then view is almost like the emotional version of that. Like, where am I fixing emotionally? I
Mm,
think art of accomplishment in general, it's all about the not resisting emotions. And so if you
mm.
notice that you're kind of like holding an emotion in or like tensing or something, then there are ways of like unresisting that. And then it's just exactly the same as Alexander technique, but on the emotional level. I'm curious whether you found that, or like what that was like for you.
Yes, I think I agree with that. And just to comment as well, I think I also noticed that we were in podcasting mode a little bit, and it's nice to call that out and drop that because not a podcast. This is just a YouTube chat. Um, uh, so one thing I would like to dig into more with AT as a domain is they don't talk so much about emotions in the general literature about it. People don't, the teachers who have gone there talk about it, but it's kind of left to you, I think, to translate the ideas into, oh, I can apply this to emotions, I can apply this to X, Y, and Z. But View does that
There's almost a
explicitly.
shying away from that. Yeah, there's almost a shying away of that in Alexander. Like, we are not therapists. We are, we're not trained in that. And even the ones who are therapists don't have that in their sessions. Like, they kind of
Mm.
keep them a bit more separate.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
it's
interrupted.
no, it's interesting because I've seen a lot of people have big emotional releases in AT contexts. Normally it's unexpected. It's because they happen to stop doing a pattern of muscle tension that's associated with a blocking of emotion, I think is my best understanding. And I remember looking at Doug Tatteran's work in the biomotor framework, where he says that you can use muscle tension to block emotion. It stands to reason the
You
other way
have to, I
around that,
think.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, you kind of go like, I'm not gonna feel it.
Yeah,
So
because
then,
emotions are a physical, like, thing. So you have to do something in order to not. Yeah, sorry.
right, exactly. No, exactly. And then what AT does is like you start to realize all the ways in which you're holding, and you stop doing that. But you've probably forgotten that from 20 years ago when you were yelled at by a teacher that specific pattern of holding corresponded to the emotion you didn't process at the time. People end up crying. So I think Peter often says that every AT teacher has a pack of tissues in their room for when someone inevitably cries. And the response, I think, in the AT world is allow it, be with it, but don't do the kind of let's go back into it and find out what caused it stuff. Um, and I do wonder what. So I know some people who are AT teachers and psychotherapists. I don't know the extent to which they integrate the two. It might simply be the case that psychotherapy has specific boundaries on what counts as psychotherapy and what you can do as a psychotherapist, and what counts as Alexander technique. So you probably can't, like, say, from an insurance purposes or from professional body purposes, mix and match perhaps. But if people were to kind of go freeform, I'm sure they could be really interesting things there to do at once.
Yeah, but there's also a thing in psychotherapy that you don't necessarily like dig into like your past traumatic experiences, because that can re-traumatize you
Yes.
unless you're doing it in a very specific way, where it's,
Hmm.
the coherence therapy model, where you've got a better like story to tell yourself about like what happened in the past.
Yeah.
And so and I also imagine maybe it's just not even needed. Like, maybe the physical release and the, the crying and whatever, maybe that is just like the thing, and maybe you don't need another. Like, I would have thought that the more useful thing about going into like the either therapy side or the emotion side
Mm.
is finding patterns of tension that you wouldn't have otherwise discovered.
Mm. Can you say more about that?
uh if I I'm in an AT lesson or something, and I have a habit of scurrying, of like
Mm.
being like, oh, I have to kind of, let me just get my something from my bag, and then I kind of go off, and then I come back, and whatever. So Peter even says something that is like on the sort of psycho emotions level, which is you're doing this because, oh, this is the important thing, like the
Mm.
important people are talking, and so you want to get the unimportant thing done and out of the way so that you can go back to the important thing, while missing that all of this is also your life.
Mm. Mm.
And wouldn't it be nice to have to live all moments of your life? And so and so if you notice like, oh, I have a thing where put myself down, or I think I pedestalize the other people, or something, then that can be a more direct way of going into what is causing the scurrying in the first place.
Yeah, I like that. And that's a good example of where the teacher can point something out in a way that the student might not realize. So if your awareness is habitually collapsed around something like scurrying, you might not notice that you're scurrying. Eventually, I would hold that you will eventually notice that. So if you practice the awareness practices, you'll one day kind of go like, oh, look, I'm scurrying. That's interesting, and go from there. But in the context of having a teacher there saying like, hey, you're doing this scurrying thing, and kind of going from there is really helpful. But there's something interesting as well linked to resisting emotions. It's almost like resisting parts of your life. So in that scurrying example, you're going like, oh, let's say I define this moment as important. Now I'm going to scurry to get something and then come back, as if that whole scurrying thing shouldn't really be happening, or doesn't count, or isn't important. And in some way, in the same sense that, view is about allowing emotions, AT is about allowing the moments that you might not count as being important in the same way as the ones that you do count as being important. So you kind of integrate all moments as equally valid in a sense, and you can be there equally for all of it. And I guess that requires an unfixation of, no, I'm going to allow everything to be here, as opposed to like compress time, space, and whatever it might be that you do when you're scurrying or whatever else.
This makes me think of how people with certain types of Alexander technique training will like right before they put hands on, then they kind of they organize themselves into the monkey position, and they kind of like, they get back there, whatever, and then they do it. And there's a kind of a carefulness and a kind of like almost like doingness to that, where it's sort of like, how is it that they have to do all of this stuff in order to instead of they are doing it all the time. And so it's interesting that some people learn Alexander technique in particular sort of ways, in particular contexts, but then with other parts of their life they don't have this. And I think in general with the emotional stuff in particular, that I don't see, like, I think some Alexander, like, okay, the teachers who come out of Peter's school, I think more often are just kind of generally like very kind of chill. It's like, wow, you're a remarkably chill person. But then not necessarily with the more body focus. Like I can see like there's a sort of a reactivity or something like that on the like emotional level, and then there's just a whole bunch of inhibition to deal with that or something. Whereas the Peter Nove style, plus also the like the Art of Accomplishment view stuff, I think kind of gets at it more kind of like universally or globally or something. I don't know what you found in that.
I've always found it, yeah, it's fascinating to watch a teacher, certain kinds of teacher, and it's not meant pejoratively, but it's a kind of a habit that I've seen that you point out, which is like, okay, I'm going to put hands on, I need to coordinate myself first and then put hands on. And I agree with the make sure you're coordinated when your hands are on a student, but there's that moment of kind of, I will now switch from my normal mode into Alexander technique mode, and that's weird to me. I think I agree with you in that position. There's one of my favorite AT teachers, her name's Fiona, she visits the school occasionally. She said that when you're teaching, it should look like you're just in the pub with someone. Like it should look nothing other than hanging out in the pub. If it looks anything different, you are doing something that looks like teaching Alexander technique, and that might be missing the point. And I remember when I was visiting the school one time, I wanted to kind of tease people a little bit, and I invited people to kind of play with not doing the thing that they do that looks like they're teaching Alexander technique, as a way of getting into it, because everyone has their own like slight habits, slight kind of facial expressions and tics and what mannerisms that they do to kind of go with the teaching. And I was like kind of curious, like, can you notice the things that you do habitually that look like AT almost, and drop that? Because that to me is a much bigger AT story. It's like it's dropping the things that, being able to drop things that were fixated ultimately. It could be anything, including your own teaching style ultimately.
Yeah, there's when I went to Congress, so I didn't know that you were supposed to get like have good organization before you put a hand on a student, and apparently this is a thing. Like like because if you put on and then you've got bad coordination,
Mm.
then you're going to be passing that on. So reasonable enough. But I didn't even kind of know that you were and then so I go to the congress and I see these people kind of like spending half a minute to kind of organize themselves before they put
Yeah.
a hand on. And whereas Peter is like, stick a hand on, like he's just kind of like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
just don't worry about it, just stick a hand. And I think that is a kind of counter to this sort of like, oh, I need to be like very
Mm.
ooh, let me just make sure that so yeah.
There is a slight, I'm trying to find the right word for this, cautiousness in the AT world. I don't know if this is a product of where Alexander came from. I can't imagine that society that he moved in the 20s in London was particularly emotionally free and casual, anything like that. He always used to wear suits for teaching, and I imagine that his students were a particular kind of people. And I wonder if there's a cultural aspect of how he did things back at the time that kind of like seeped through into modern day. Because there is something about like, I need to demonstrate that I'm coordinated almost, that's going on. And my take, I think the same as Peter's take, is that if you're just coordinated, then why do that? Just be coordinated. Stay coordinated. That's surely easier than having to remember to become coordinated in a workshop setting to then put your hands on someone to do a thing. Yeah, I'm basically agreeing with you.
Do you think actors have a harder or an easier time with this?
Oh, I haven't spent enough time with actors. I can imagine there's different kinds of acting, right? So is it method acting where you basically are constantly embodying the character and you're just like totally in it? And I can imagine other kinds of acting where you kind of turn up at the theatre and switch onto that mode, then leave and kind of go back to yourself. How much bleed through there is and how much you can bring your whole self and kind of get mixed up with it. I can imagine that it's easier if you're used to putting on a character and then turning them off again, to make it a continuous experience. But I'm also aware that I'm very much waffling this answer, so I assume that I don't know.
I once met an actor who, and I'd not met an actor before, and I was startled by his presence. Like he just kind of walked in the room and then had the kind of the star quality. And I was asking him like kind of what's up with that, and he said most people are just bad actors, as in most people kind of like they are kind of performing, but they don't know how to, and so then they do all of this doing stuff. And so I wonder if it's a bit like that, like actors learn how to not perform in a way.
Yeah. Well, I guess there is something in that. I remember watching a YouTube video of, I think it's not Juilliard, but some acting school where there was an AT teacher kind of guiding the students, the actors, through various exercises. And one of the things they were saying is that acting with AT is as much about acting the character as you, right? So you're bringing yourself to bear as this person that you're playing the character. And if that character's feeling angry, you have to feel angry. You're going to feel angry. And the point is, how do you allow and express and contain that, let's say, anger in a way that doesn't compromise you as the actor, it doesn't like hurt you, but you can fully allow yourself to be directed by the thing that you're playing. So you are acting without doing it, if you like.
This is to connect it back to the art of accomplishment stuff. I was just listening to the second episode on anger, and one of the things is that if you find it difficult to, I think this is especially for people who tend to express anger by taking it out on other people. If you think of it as playing the role of an actor who is angry, and that this is just a story, like this is not like kind of you feel it to some extent, but then not all the way. That can help you do like actually access, or even if you've got kind of more like anger suppression, if you act as if you are angry, then that can unlock actual emotions. So there is something to this sort of acting thing where it changes the way that you think about your emotions or your state or something, that for some reason gets you to a more authentic place, both in Alexander technique and in view art of accomplishment.
That's really interesting. So what came to mind as you were saying that for me is acting is almost a way of not being your existing model of yourself, in a sense. Like if you think, I'm not someone who gets angry, then you can act as some. It's unfixation. You can act as, okay, I'm not. It's not me. Then it's someone else. And I can almost see that identity is the ultimate fixation, in a sense. And this is again pure Buddhism. If you can learn to unfixate from your identity, then you can basically do anything. But acting as someone else is actually a way of unfixating from who you think you are. So I can see why that would work.
Neat. Acting has a strange kind of stereotype connotations where like actors are a bit weird, and although schools have acting classes or something, it doesn't feel like it's this is kind of fundamental to being a human in the world. And there's something strange about that.
Yeah. I don't know enough actors, I think.
The sun is in my eyes. I'm just going to adjust my
no worries.
situation here. There we go.
While you're adjusting, I will point out to you and anyone watching that the video is quite choppy. So the audio is very clear. So anyone who's watching, I apologize. I will get Riverside next time and we'll do the local recording. But on this instance, it may not be so clear. I wanted to ask, now that you've done a whole bunch of View and are doing more and more AT, like when you practice AT in training, for example, or at Congress, did you find yourself kind of also doing View, kind of unintentionally or intentionally, or is it quite a separate thing for you?
Much like I find myself unintentionally doing Alexander technique, I think it's both of them have just altered my baseline of how I show up in the world. So can I think of any instances where I did that in particular? View has affected what I notice a lot. So one of the reasons that I've been urging you to do View for a long time, and especially in the context of Alexander technique, I see people have particular reactions or like a kind of like they are doing or whatever, and so one answer is saying like, oh well, just don't do, just non-do, but that's not so easy. And if you're thinking about like, where am I being partial, that can produce different answers from just like, oh, where am I doing? Because doing is a kind of, it's such a broad thing, whereas partial is like, where do I have an agenda? Where do I want a specific outcome? And that can help with like finding what are the actual ends I'm trying to gain in the first place. So and then also considering emotional reactions as part of Alexander technique instead of that's that separate thing that's like because we're about mind and body but not like heart or something like that, or like mind and muscles but then not like everything else that's going on there. And so that's why I kind of feel like View is a really great way of digging into like the whole person, the whole I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting that you mention
I do find myself
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Finish the thought, go
on. If I'm in an Alexander technique lesson and I notice some kind of like reaction come up, then either I can think like, okay, get back the space, what is all of that? Or I can be like, like where am I not in one of the four like View things. And also there's especially for me anyway, the empathy thing of like feeling yourself. Like so Peter says like, oh well, when I'm doing Alexander technique, I'm not aware of my body, like I'm aware of the space and everything. And sometimes there's a kind of a thing of, but then he also says take charge of yourself. And sometimes I use the empathy as in like feeling my own body, which like slightly goes against his thing, but it's more like a kind of a psychological kind of acknowledging that I exist thing. And then so I use that to better do the Alexander technique.
So it's like another way in to the AT thing. Like it's saying, rather than kind of doing the global unfixation move, which AT encourages, like, okay, looking in these four very clear domains, where am I doing some kind of fixation and can I drop it? So it's giving you places to look almost that are
Because if you stop doing
contextual.
the wrong thing, the right thing does itself. So so if you directly just like look for the wrong thing and then undo
Yeah.
that, then also so that you can do both sides, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny that you were saying how you're kind of talking about psycho and physical unity as kind of where AT people look. I know that Alexander talked about unification of mind, body, and spirit. Now, it's not clear what he means by spirit, and it's always a bit fuzzy, but there are other domains almost that everything is integrated ultimately, and you can see how far you want to push the understanding of this. But in the human model, sure, like mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, all of these things are one process. You can watch the conversation with Jake to talk about the entire universe being one thing as well, and that kind of being the AT way into non-dualism. But I do find that the AT world maybe hasn't caught up yet to the spiritual and emotional unity elements with the other two. We know that it's very focused on the physical side of psychophysical unity, being honest. Peter's thing is much more the psycho end of psychophysical. But I'm really interested that View is opening a window into the emotional side of things, specifically in human connection, to point out fixations, and then you can use that as a way into dropping it. Because you're right, in what way am I being partial? In what way am I kind of not wondering? In what way am I not being empathetic? Then just keeps, okay, turns out I do want an answer. Okay, interesting. Turns out I am, either suppressing myself too much or blending too much with this person, and that's causing me to lose. That's when Peter says, take charge of yourself. It's when there's some inappropriate distance, inappropriate separation, either too much or too little, that you can resolve almost.
I mean, we say that the Alexander world has not taken this on. Anthony Kingsley is a psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm.
Penelope Easton, in her book, I haven't read this section yet, but if I look on the back, there's like a list of all of the things that she goes into, and one of them is attachment theory and like hemispheres of the brain, which is like the Ian McGilchrist stuff, and like all of this stuff, and what's it, polyvagal theory, or like all of this stuff that is usually kind of connected with emotions. And then also I was just listening to a podcast, Body Learning, and it was a specific episode. It was called something like Alexander Technique and Awakening. And it was this guy who had like some kind of awakening experiences around Alexander Technique, and who did his teacher train under? Dave Gorman.
Amazing.
And I think like anyone who's kind of that sort of awareness, and he talked about like that he had some pain, and David Gorman didn't say like, okay, like now we're going to sort out your shoulder. He said, okay, well, let's get the space, and then afterwards he said, okay, now how's your pain? Which is and I think it's this way of doing Alexander Technique where you're getting kind of the space, you're doing the kind of the global thing, and then so I don't know, like, he said something like, in this podcast, this guy said, well, I don't like to use the word spiritual, but and so like I think there are these pockets that are kind of like aware of this, but I agree that it's not that as a sort of a general thing. Like if you go to like the average like Alexander Technique teacher, they're not going to go into that, and there'll be like a resistance into going into that.
Yeah, I think so. I totally agree that there are many pockets of people who do get this. And again, just for context, David Gorman was Peter's teacher. So our lineage, if you like, came via this awareness first model. I guess what I'm getting at a little bit is, when I explain what AT is to people who haven't heard of it, who have just vaguely heard of it, I always have to say, oh, it's not that postural thing that you may think it is. I don't have to say, oh, it's not therapy, or oh, it's not awakening, because people don't think of it as that, because the world, the AT world, is sufficiently marketed itself as posture. And I think that's ironically, the fixation of a lot of the industry, the profession. And there's some people are kind of going, no, it's other stuff as well, but yeah, it's still rooted. But I don't want to imply that, no one's thought about this before in terms of the psycho-spiritual, emotional side of things as well.
I have a question for you, and that is, what do you get from AT that you don't get from view, and what do you get from view that you don't get from AT, especially the second one, but both of them?
So caveating with, I haven't done that much view yet. I've just done the connection course once, so I'd want to do more. With AT, I get what feels like much more generalizable practice. Like I can apply it anywhere, to anything ultimately. So if I had this experience a few weeks ago. I have very stiff hips. I'm going straight into the physical side again, but it applies everywhere, right? So it's fine. Very stiff hips from a childhood of very bad knee injuries, and my hips are kind of just stiffened up in safety response, ultimately to protect various things. And I was doing this stretch, and I suddenly, for the first time, became aware clearly of the fact that I was tensing my my hip flexors. It wasn't that they were just stiff. It's that some part of me was doing tension, to, keep my legs stable or whatever. And I could go from there. I was like, okay, I'm doing this, so I can inhibit this. And I kind of looked around. I kind of did a few guesses at what inhibition might look like in that context. And before anything happened with my hip, I got a kind of internal, are you sure? sense, or like is it safe? Do you really want this? Is this okay? Kind of response coming from somewhere inside me. And I went like, yeah, I think so. I think it's safe now. Kind of like reassuring, kind of IFS style communication with, I guess, my hip flexor, or with whatever part of me that was holding my hip flexor. And then this thing eased off, and my hip flexor gave, huge relaxation, huge like kind of an emotional wave, and all the kind of stuff that you'd expect from a long pattern of holding going away. And that, to me, was foundationally an Alexander technique practice. It was noticing something new, inhibiting it in a constructive way, in a way that I thought was honoring my parts that might, don't want to be like brute force through ultimately. And I don't think I'd get that from view. Or if I do, I think I'd need to be taking some liberties with the instruction or the philosophy of view, and saying, okay, I'm going to apply this to internal parts and to my hips. And right, view for me is really useful in the sense that I am talking to someone and I can realize all the ways in which I'm blocking connection with them, which AT doesn't specifically go into. You could notice these things if you were paying attention. If you were like shown the domains, which is what view does, then sure, I could notice it. But it feels like view is a more detailed, specific application of the thing aimed at connection in conversation with people. And AT is a generalized thing, although you can apply them both to the same kind of stuff, if you like, if you wanted to, if you kind of made that connection.
Is there an example of a non-body focused aspect of AT that you wouldn't get from view?
Right now, I'm starting to think of one, because I do think that you could maybe say that view adequately captures all the ways in which you could be fixated. There might be other ways, but I suspect that if you go through vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder, and are in the desired version of that, so you're not fixated on the blocks, if you like, that takes you to a globally unfixated state. One of my experiences with AT, which is not physical, was suddenly noticing the doing process of, I felt like I had to do the world, like I had to put effort in to sustain the running of the world, and I could inhibit that process. And when I did that, I had this vast expansion, opening, vividness experience. Again, you could argue that view is a similar way in. It's like, am I being partial to the world being a certain kind of way, or am I guarding against something? Am I not being vulnerable to the world? So I can see how view could take you in that direction, but you kind of have to like play with definitions a little bit just to get there, I think. Whereas AT is very direct.
And also, right, because view is focused on a person instead of like your environment.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
There was a thing that so I went to this party in the Bay Area with a lot of art of accomplishment people. And one person noticed, and so I was talking about Alexander technique as I always do at parties, and makes me very popular. No, and he said that he noticed that I have a different I can't remember if it was something like eye patterns or like kind of presence in the room,
Mm.
in that I was sort of keeping track of like every like group of conversation, and
Yeah.
like I was sort of like, I was there, I was having a conversation with someone, but I was also kind of interested in all of this as well. And um and so and, and these are people who've done like a lot of art of accomplishment stuff,
Mm.
and they are extremely present with people. Like they are the most present people basically with in connection that I've ever met. Um and yet there was something that was slightly different about the like I'm also filling the room.
Mm. Mm.
So something around the environment there.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting because
What?
I can imagine that you could be very viewy with someone in a collapsed way, almost. So like you're with them only, if you like. You're viewy just with them and not viewy with everything else, perhaps.
I think it's yeah, it's still less collapsed than anyone having a normal conversation with another person where they cannot see, like, if you were to wave, then they just wouldn't be able to see you because they're looking slightly like they had like
Mm.
more kind of expanded, but it was still not like the whole thing.
Mm.
So I imagine that, yeah, like I mean, I think with both Alexander technique and view, the more you do each of them, then the more you get the thing that is coming from the other side. It just sort of takes longer. So like the more
Mm.
you do kind of view, and the more you're kind of like, because like why are you blocking off the world in the first place? Well, like, you're in these habits of not, because like then it's too much information, or then you don't feel safe, or whatever, and so you confine yourself. And then if you feel safe, and if you feel like,
Mm.
oh, it's okay for me to be scared, then I can like take into account like the dodgy guy, like when I'm walking down the street or something. So
Yeah.
you can get there from both ways.
One thing I find interesting about vulnerability and view, it's come up a lot for me recently, is that in my own practice of AT, I'm finding myself that I can do the big present expanded thing. I just often choose not to for some reason. And I think this is some kind of emotional thing that's kind of causing me to not want to be so big, if you like, or not want to be so visible or present or whatever that thing is that we can do. And there's something around safety coming up for me, in that for me right now, it doesn't feel fully safe to be
Mm.
my full Alexander self that only really is allowed to come up in the training context, where I'm like, okay, I'm just going to turn this on fully, fine, whatever. I don't care. It's safe here. But there's some self-constraining going on that I don't want to brute force my way through right now. And I'm kind of looking for ways that I can create safety or like figure out why I'm doing this. And I think view might be the vulnerability point, I think, is linked to this.
Yeah, that, and also something like appropriate empathy, appropriate boundaries, um, something around like it's okay if you have a certain emotional experience in response to something.
Mm.
One of the places that I like practicing Alexander technique most is the London Underground.
Yes.
I just like it just made the London Underground like much more pleasant, and it's like,
Hmm.
cool, I can be curious about all of these people. And however, when I tried to do this on the New York Underground, I just could like, I was like, this feels uncomfortable. I don't like, these people are much
Huh.
scarier. Like, I don't know these people. Like there's a kind of and I don't fully know, like, and I noticed like, I don't want to expand my awareness, because if I did, that would be acknowledging some scary things. And I
Mm.
thought, okay, they still exist, they are still there, they could still
Yes.
like come into my space and whatever. So but yeah, but I do think that the more I do the kind of the connection course stuff, then the more I know that if I have a reaction to something, then it's okay. It won't like freeze me up. It won't like
Mm.
get me in a kind of stuck place. It's like, cool, I can be there with my experience of feeling like afraid, or feeling judgmental, or feeling whatever, and just kind of own that. and then so it makes it easier to expand to the places where it would otherwise be unnerving or something.
Totally. And there's something interesting about being able to notice the spaces to which you're not comfortable expanding into, almost. Like that itself is a thing that you can notice, and then kind of
Yeah.
work with. Because why is it that I don't want to expand into this intellectual, emotional, physical space? Like, why am I resisting? Like, that's interesting. Let's play with that. Let's kind of go, okay, what's unsafe? What do I think I can't be with or stand?
Mhm.
And one thing you said about the New York subway, um, I'm making no comments about the relative safety of the two systems, but there is something about when you are fully expanded, you are more interesting to people. Like you will stand out more, I think. So there is something about knowing that there are sometimes it's just not a good idea to be very star quality-y, I think, and maybe that was
Maybe
playing into it.
it's because English people are more introverted and so they won't care, but whereas New York people
Yes,
might notice. I don't know. This is just a
maybe.
guess.
I mean, on the tube, you're never going to get hassled, whatever you do, really. Like, no one's going to come talk to you. I think. Whereas maybe in New York, people will kind of be more able to like. The barriers are not quite as firm as they are in London. So someone might just approach you in New York where they just you
Yeah.
wouldn't expect them to in London.
Yeah, I like how Art of Accomplishment kind of gives you a map of things that you might be fixed on
Mm,
or fixated on, things that, like, if there is some kind of emotion that you don't want to feel, you know that there is something there that you could
mm,
do that would be like, oh yeah, I can feel this emotion and whatever. And then if that is the thing that's getting in the way of your expanded awareness, like,
mm.
mind body unity and stuff, then okay, you've got this specific thing.
Yeah, which makes me think what other things are there like that we could bring into AT. So if we assume that view is specific AT applied to conversations to promote connection, and I don't want to like say that view is that, but like as a thing that AT can learn from view, I wonder now what other domains and properties of things you could look for fixations exist almost. Like in
Huh.
bodies, for example, like, yeah, you can often tell, okay, let me check my knees, my hips, and my head neck, for example, my AO joint. Like those are the places that fixations tend to happen. If I'm feeling fixated, I'll just look in those places first and then see about unfixating them and then go from there, for example. I wonder where else this might show up in other domains.
So we've talked about emotions, which is the art of accomplishment stuff, and we've talked about physical, which is Alexander technique stuff. I wonder if there's something in intellectual.
Mm.
So this sort of, I don't know, fallibilism or this kind of like open-mindedness or something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to take a second to just get up a quote because it's very relevant. And I would never do this normally on a podcast, but it's not a podcast, so it's totally fine. um, but I have an essay or a note, I guess, on the website. So a quote from Frank Pierce Jones, who was an AT teacher, quoting John Dewey. So John Dewey considered that the Alexander technique provided a demonstration of the unity of body and mind. With progress as a pupil, he reported an improvement in his vision and in his breathing, and in an ability to hold a philosophical position calmly, with ability to change it if new evidence warranted. And that to me is like, though that last thing is not like the others, right? It's not like his breathing and stuff. It's he can change his philosophical position if evidence arises because he's unfixated on holding. He's actually impartial, I guess, going back to view language. Um, so I wonder how you could like kind of point out the ways in which you might be fixated philosophically or fixated in intellectual space. It might be because you want a certain outcome, because you have a certain political leaning, because it's better for you if a certain thing is true or not. But there must be a list of things, and you're probably better suited to talk about this than I am, about ways in which people kind of get stuck and kind of not be fallibilists, I guess.
Yeah, it reminds me of a thing you said, that you speculated that possibly the reason that or part of the reason that I
Mm.
got on with AT so well in the first place was that I come from this philosophical tradition that is extremely like all about like unfixating basically like fallibilism. You could be wrong, like think of all of this different stuff. So yeah, I don't know about Lisp. I'd have to think about that. But and I know someone who encountered this philosophy, the critical rationalism thing, and specifically a particular part. I think it was the anyway. And he said that reading it made him feel like he was in the same state that he gets into when he's meditating. And so and that kind of like, I think that is the same kind of like, there is some kind of unfixated thing. Also, when you're learning a lot and you're learning quite quickly, then there's this kind of state of mind that you get into. It's like, wow, like everything I thought before is wrong, and like there's this whole world has sort of opened up. And I think you also get into this kind of alive Alexander technique / view like state.
Yeah, the thing that's coming to mind for me is familiarity, in the sense that when something is familiar, that's when you're fixated and you can't notice a familiar thing. So one of the principles of AT is faulty sensory appreciation, which is the thing that you do a lot will eventually, let's say, distort your senses such that the thing that is wrong will feel right to you, and then the thing that is right will feel wrong. Now, I wonder how much of intellectual navigation we do based on things that feel right, in a sense. Like, this must be the position because it feels right to me, but no one ever checks whether their sense of what feels right is in fact right. So when you're in that sense of, oh, I was wrong, I could be wrong about this, like, you're almost guiding yourself by a sense of unfamiliarity, which almost by definition in those terms is unfixated. It's not stuck in the groove of familiar things. I'm kind of curious, I guess, like, I actually don't know in detail what fallibilism is, and I'm not asking for a kind of a detailed explanation, but can you give like a potted like summary of what is this philosophy that people seem to kind of think is like AT?
Yeah, it's so traditionally, there's kind of, on the one side we've got there is objective truth and we can know it and we can have the truth, and then on the other side, you know, we can never be sure, and therefore there is no objective truth, and we're just kind of like, you know, doing stuff, and oh well. And then the fallibilism is kind of walking the fine line between them, which is like, there is a reality, but we can never be sure that we know it, or like we can never know it fully, or something, or like we can never, like we can know it sort of arbitrarily well in a particular, but we can always be making mistakes. And so the idea is that, like, however certain or whatever, or however good our ideas are, they're never going to be actually the truth. And so this kind of means that like everything is always open, and possibility is always there all of the time. And then there's a sort of a at least in the version that is kind of popular on Twitter, which is inspired by David Deutsch, who is inspired by Karl Popper. It has a kind of an optimistic quality, and by optimistic I mean these problems are soluble. Like, it is possible to learn things better. And so there's a kind of like, you are allowed to be in the world fully, and like, you know, really kind of pursue anything that you want to pursue because it is possible, and also you know that you don't know it. And so there's a kind of a way that you can get to that sort of state.
I wonder if there's a link here with Alexander's don't try and do the right thing, just notice and avoid doing the wrong things, and then the right thing will emerge from there almost.
That is basically Karl Popper's critical rationalism. That's what the critical is. It's like, okay, well, given that we can't know, like we have all of these ideas, and so we try to find errors in them, and then we solve those errors, and then something better emerges, or something like that.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So this is something that might be maybe a research project for us separately, or a different geeky conversation, but some of the people who were early proponents of Alexander technique were also kind of tangentially involved in the Popper world. So John Dewey specifically was a big-time proponent of AT, wrote forwards to the books, and I'm sure that his philosophy intersects to some extent with fallibilism or Karl Popper stuff.
Yeah, lots of people mistake Karl Popper for being pragmatist. So they are at least close enough that people mistake. There's some slight differences, but I think they probably overlap more than they don't.
Interesting. So I guess I'm just curious how much intellectual sharing there was going on between these different ideas. I mean, Alexander was not one who would often credit others for ideas. I think I think he may have lifted some stuff from other people and it wasn't known. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was kind of a general zeitgeist of stuff going on that was kind of, Aldous Huxley as well was involved and that kind of thing. Like what was going on in that scene almost, and was he closer than we think perhaps to it? It just fascinates me.
Yeah, something to look up.
Yeah, cool. Exactly.
Yeah. I want to go back to an earlier question because I asked, what can you get from Alexander technique that you can't get from Vue, and then the other way around, and I can't remember which one we did, but we didn't do the other one.
Yeah, I did AT, but not from Vue. What can I get from Vue that I don't get from AT? I think the intention of connection, I think, is the thing that Vue gives. Like, there is this thing called connection, which you can cultivate and get more of, and you can get there specifically by unfixating from these 4 domains and allowing more of that stuff. I think that, so in general, I think that AT can do most things. It's just, it doesn't give any, like, signposting necessarily. Like, it's kind of, off you go then, a little bit. Whereas what Vue does is it cultivates and makes important and useful this sense of like, no, human connection is good actually, and we can make it better. We can be good at it via these specific ways that will be very generative and good. I think I can imagine some AT teacher kind of going off and being like, okay, when I talk to people, I have this state, but it wouldn't be so well articulated. I think it wouldn't be so well framed. And crucially, I think it wouldn't be so easy, well, I don't say easy, but scalable in the way that Joe has done with Vue. If you try to go in to teach the connection course with AT using AT principles, you'd very quickly get a bit stuck and it wouldn't scale the same way as like, look, here are these 4 things, just more vulnerability, more impartiality, more empathy, more wonder, and you'll get there.
Stuck?
I think you'd start talking about psychophysical, like all the AT world, I think in general, aside from Peter, who doesn't use these words, relies quite a lot on Alexander's jargon and framing and that kind of thing. And part of the reason I think that I'm among the first to do what I've done with the online course is that I'm not getting caught up in the traditional language. But
okay, but what about like Gorman trained, like Gorman lineage?
I think anyone Gorman lineage would. So I never met David Gorman, I don't know, but I assume that anyone kind of going into it from like this is an awareness first thing would find it easier to like link with Vue. I can well imagine a traditional AT teacher taking Vue and going like, "Whoa, this is a totally different thing," for example. And the more like awarenessy you are on the AT spectrum, the more you'll realize that that's actually the same thing in many ways.
The experience I was just having when you first kind of started talking about, oh yeah, it's about connection. Like whenever I think like, oh yes, it's about connection. Hi, Michael. Like there's a kind of a thing there. I get an aliveness and a kind of like switched on, like instead of just being kind of like, I'm in this space and isn't the space nice or whatever, there's a kind of a directness, and I don't mean like kind of collapsed directness, but in a kind of like, this is a real thing, this is an alive thing. And I think I get that more from Vue than I do like it is present in like Peter does, like, you know, emphasize like, yes, like get curious about the environment, like whatever, but it's a kind of it's not the root in. Whereas with connection, like immediately it kind of gives me something to organize around, and it kind of it sort of turns on this life thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you get that experience or whether this makes sense to you.
It does make sense. So there's this so Peter uses the term aliveness a lot. So it's not just awareness, it's also aliveness. And aliveness is, I think, linked to the primary control that Alexander talks about, which is hard to pin down exactly what that thing is, but Peter talks about it in terms of the intention and attentional system. So when you have clear and strong intention towards something, and your attention is directed that way in the context of a big space, then you get this alive thing that you're pointing at. And what view does is it tells you, or it gives you an invitation to be like, okay, I intend to be with this person and my attention is on them in such a way as I'm unfixated. It opens up that channel that Peter talks about, I think.
Yeah, not just be with the person, but also especially if you're thinking about wonder. So wonder is a path to what am I actually interested in?
Yes.
What do I actually want to do here? And so if you have that sort of wonder plus the other things where it's this almost kind of focusing thing, like instead of being very kind of diffuse and blurry and whatever, it's like, cool, well, like what am I interested in? And then that kind of switches on this sort of like, you know, childlike curiosity and whatever, and it's like, cool, like how what is Michael's experience right now? And there's a kind of, yeah.
And that's interesting, right? Because a lot of people, I think, when they're having conversations, they're usually living in their own heads. They're listening to, let's say I'm talking to you and I listen to your words and I'm thinking in my head like, oh, she's saying this, I should say this, and it's quite a narrow awareness of what's going on. But when you bring in like wonder and empathy and all the domains, in fact, it's like I'm talking to you and I'm always aware of the stuff going on in me and in you that, oh, look, I'm being partial and there's a thing over here and oh, I'm curious about this over here. And like you open up availability to all the other stuff as well, which you can, and then you can say stuff like in view, like you could just say like, I remember one of the examples that Joe used in the connection course with like, why are you being such an asshole right now? But said in like a view way. And like, it sure seems like you're being a real asshole right now. I'm really curious as to what's going on there. You know? And like to be able to say that first involves like recognizing that you're getting like a bit defensive or some kind of response to their way of being, that there's a sense of safety and that it's okay to say that in a way that is in service of the conversation or with the connection. And that kind of opens up your awareness and couldness, the term that Hashin coined. I'm like, could I say this thing? Oh, no, I could. I'm going to. Cool. Okay. Not that you're blocked off from certain pathways. So that Peter's like, could I go anywhere right now? Could I say anything? I think view opens that up in terms of vulnerability.
Yeah, and there's also the empathy thing. So a lot of our training has hand on the back and then kind of like being able to sense which direction someone is going to, and or like being able to kind of coordinate and kind of like sync up with each other. If you are scared of the person, or if you are afraid of like actually kind of being in the same room, or if you are afraid of yourself and so you're like, I'm just going to be a follower, it does not work as well. It works when you are taking charge of yourself, you know, you can feel yourself, your whatever, and also you're with the person, and also you can feel them. And so it really sort of and empathy in particular, I think, is a way of undoing those little fears, those little resistances to being both like yourself and like you can know intellectually like, yes, I should take charge of myself, and I did like for a while, but it wasn't until I started incorporating the empathy thing where there's a kind of an emotional component that I didn't quite like, because like if you are not allowed to feel your emotions, which us as English people are not, like British people, it's difficult to really kind of go all the way there and to feel safe and stuff, and so it kind of just like unlocks that and also gives you a thing to look for or something.
Yeah, and there's something else on this empathy thing around the hands-on process. So in AT, as you were saying, like I put my hand on your back and I'm suddenly like mapping your psychophysical spiritual system in mine, in a sense. Like I can very clearly tell what your awareness is doing, if your mind wandering, all that kind of stuff. And not only that, but I can tell if there's holding and like, if there's muscle tension. There's all kinds of stuff that you can just pick up. But the important thing is to be able to distinguish that it's not my stuff. Right? I'm there with you experiencing your stuff, often in my own body or in my own awareness. Like I can tell that my awareness is constricting, but it's not coming from me, right? That's empathy, right? It's the sense of like, I'm here with your experience and knowing it's not my experience, but still feeling it fully. So it's a hands-on training of that in a sense.
Yeah, there's something around projection. Because so there's one episode, and apparently I think the in-person Art of Accomplishment stuff goes into this more. There's one episode on projection. It's this idea that whenever you have a a judgment or a reaction or a pedestalizing or any of these things about another person, like whenever you're like, triggered about another person, in some sense that is a projection. So either I would not be able to feel that myself, or like if they feel that, then oh no, that means something about me, or like that there's something like that. And so if someone else being let's say like anxious or something causes you to then start like being anxious, what's happening is what is happening here? uh yeah, it's kind of like you are taking it on in some, I don't know, there's a half-formed thought here that I feel like something needs to be, because it's like if you take something on and it's not yours, then if you recognize it's not yours, then you can like navigate it better. I don't know, this is a half-formed thought. You
But
can dig me out of it all.
I think there is something there around the moment of recognizing when something isn't yours, almost. So like empathy is a tricky one, I think, for a lot of people because they get so caught up in a strong experience. So like, let's say a person they love is suffering and they're suffering as well. And to recognize that, oh, hang on, they're suffering in their way. I'm suffering in my way in response to theirs, but their feeling is not my feeling. And I can kind of create this distance almost, not like a pushing away, but like a more appropriate relating to it. And then once I can honor their experience as their experience and my experience as my experience, then we can kind of engage at this like individuated, separate, like we are our own humans, take charge of yourself model people, as opposed to like me being caught up in this person almost. I don't think that's as constructive a way of relating.
Yeah, I guess it's so the empathy of the putting some attention in your own body as well as being able to feel the other person. When we get very affected by other people's emotions, I think basically that's when we leave ourselves, when we leave our body, when we leave like what I want, what I feel, and everything, and you're just kind of like in the other person. So yeah, so having that, and then that can be scary because then it's like, oh, I'm a full person and my wants matter.
Yes. Yeah, that can be scary. And I think that's going back to what I was saying earlier with there are contexts in which I don't want to fully turn on the AT thing. You could argue it's a bit of a cope in that I don't want to take full responsibility for myself in some contexts, kind of like diminishing myself or not taking charge of myself or kind of absconding in some way. That's the less charitable take. The other take is some kind of sense of safety. But there's something about, owning your own experience and being present with all of it at the same time as other stuff's going on at the same time.
I think it's worth noting here that there's also the opposite thing, which is when you are like fully in yourself and then cut off from the world, cut off from other people. Like, I'm the hero of this story, like, and other people are kind of like, oh, you exist. There's a sort of, and maybe because you and I like have more the leaving ourselves habit, that we're kind of talking about that more. But then there's also the other type of thing, and View also helps with that because it also gives you a guide about how to be empathetic with other people and how to be with them without like losing that precious thing, which is like, having yourself there.
Yeah, it is interesting how vulnerability, I think, opens up that route into I am here in all my fullness and I'm allowing myself to be affected by the world. I'm still part of the world. Because what you're describing there of like, I'm the main character and it's all about me, but the rest of the world isn't really there, is a guardedness in a sense. It's like, yes, my awareness is expanded. There's a bubble of big awareness, but it's a very like firm, impermeable boundary in a sense. But what you can do is like, yes, my awareness is out there and it's kind of diffuse and porous, and I am allowing myself to be affected by the things that happen in the world, come what they may be, if you like. And that's something that View, I think, specifically addresses that AT might be a bit of a failure mode, because I think some teachers I've seen have been kind of guarded in that sense. Like they have their awareness, but it's like a little bit armored in a sense, I think. And View cuts through that.
So it cuts through via the vulnerability thing?
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about vulnerability being what happens when you inhibit guardedness. When you stop doing guardedness, you get vulnerability. So you have to look for, okay, in what ways am I being guarded? Okay, interesting. I'll stop doing that. Allow, risk of getting hurt, feeling things, that kind of thing. But if you don't know to look for guardedness and that you can stop doing that and then be okay with the full expression of what might come, then you just wouldn't think to look there, I think, or it wouldn't be a thing that you check in with frequently in conversation or in engaging with the world more broadly. And that's why I think view is particularly powerful. It's like, hey, this in particular, there's a thing right here, and this is important.
I'm still like 15% doing what would be good for a podcast.
Yeah,
what would make you feel more connected right now?
It's funny. I think part of my my podcasty mode has been our internet connection has not been ideal, at least at my end. I don't know what you've been seeing. But it's funny, when I'm talking, your video is more fluid. But when you're talking, you get more freeze-framey and jagged, which is really interesting as a conversational experience, because when I'm talking, I get connection with you because I can see more of you, your responses. But then when you're talking, I get less of that. So I'm kind of inferring more from your voice without the video of what's going on. So I'm like weirdly losing connection when you're talking and gaining connection back when I'm talking, while also trying to navigate my own thoughts and say things that sound coherent. This is a really interesting context to be, and also knowing that people listening, hi folks, at the same time, it's just an interesting layer of things to be managing.
Yep,
what would you like to
problems?
Yeah. What would you like to drop to get
more
more connection? Yeah. We can stretch.
Yeah, there's a nice thing in Vue, and then especially in the masterclass, where there's a lot of shaking it off, and there's a lot of because we get into these fixed sort of I don't know, we bodies process emotions physically. Yeah. And so if an emotion is building up and we're sitting here and we're on chairs, which, Alexander technique is very against, just the existence of chairs.
Yeah.
We get that. So Peter also shakes people sometimes if they're being quite rigid. I wonder if there's a connection there.
When you say shapes, what do you mean?
Shake.
Oh, shakes. He shakes. Yeah, yes. Give you a belt looping. For context for those listening, that means because that sounds weird. He'll put his fingers in someone's belt loops and shake them around their hips and that kind of thing, so they kind of loosen up. Again, I think it comes back to fixation. There are endless ways in which we can get fixated, and interestingly or weirdly, annoyingly, this frame of we're using a bit of software called Ecamm Live, which is great, except that even because of the way it's framed, there's even less of us that we can move than a Zoom call. I'm way narrower in the frame that you see than I would be on a Zoom call, which would be out here somewhere. So I'm we're both having to be in a very narrow space, near our microphones, sitting here, doing the podcast thing. Whereas in person, we could go for a walk, we could do a little dance, we could shake, we could do all manner of things to unfixate, and we're having to find the ways we're fixating and find freedom within this very constrained frame is a weird thing to have to do. So I think finding connection in this frame is challenging, but the fact that you can do it is actually a miracle in many ways, I think.
I thought of another way that Vue helped me with Alexander technique. So I mentioned the eye gazing thing. Another thing they have is to uncross your arms and legs, because if you're cross your body language, then you're going to be guarded and you're not letting in the full experience. And I think that is a lot closer to kind of what the well-functioning Alexander mode is. But also, if I find myself doing these crosses, it's not just a kind of a physical thing that I'm crossed. It's also it helps with learning. It helps with learning because if you're uncrossed, then you're kind of allowing information to come in, and you're sort of less. And there's something, I don't know. There's something there anyway. Have you found anything like that?
Yeah, it's that general state of availability, right? So if you're in this state, there's a sense of I know the answer, or I'm not welcoming new stuff, or just nah, really. Um, but it's the same as why AT people, at least in our lineage, almost tend to sway a little bit when we stand. It's oh yeah, I could. I'm not like stuck here. Um, so it's like I'm open and available in all directions in a sense. Whereas at least an arm crossing or a crossed leg, it does fixate you, and it does kind of, at least in one direction, it says like, no, I'm not open in that direction. It might just be more comfortable, but there is something around like, I am comfortable here and I don't want this thing. I don't want to be open to that thing. To the extent that you can read a crossed arm as meaning no. I'm not convinced personally that a crossed arm always means like shielding or guarding. But being aware of when it
You're
does.
cold.
Sometimes you're cold,
Yeah.
sometimes just more comfortable. Sometimes you want to stretch you or whatever, or it's just a habit. But in general, I think, yeah, being able to notice the things that you do that it's so funny. Like, we're going for like an hour and 14 minutes, and this kind of conversation, it's very hard to use direct language. So I think for me, at least, like, I'm always using language kind of indirectly around the thing I'm talking about. And my brain is like, why couldn't we do a thing like physics where it's just like you use the exact word for the right thing, and so everyone's very clear. It's just like, that's the word. You're not kind of like finger pointing at moon stuff all the time. But yeah, so being able to notice when you are not available in certain directions and then drop that, I think, is what I'm getting at, is very useful. And Vue is good
Yeah,
at that in
there's a
connection
thing.
contexts.
Yeah, and there's the thing in Art of Accomplishment more generally, including in Vue, of embrace intensity. This doesn't mean create intensity, as in like if you're having a reaction, then like cool, like I'm having this reaction, and then it's almost like non-do your emotions or non-do your reactions. Like don't be like, oh, there's a thing coming up, and so I need to get into doing mode. It's like, okay, I'm about to have an experience. Let's see what happens,
Yeah.
and that's very Alexander, I would say as well.
From having done a bunch of Vue stuff, like when you can tell that a big emotion is coming, for example, what do you think the doing response is? Is it like a guarding of like, no, can't have that? Or might it be a, I must do the big emotion thing? Like, what's the doing that comes in when emotions arise, do you think?
I mean, I've done both. I think
Mm.
the standard one is the being guarded, or like, oh, I don't know if this is going to be okay, or I don't know what I'm going to say in this state, or I don't know if other people are going to accept me. Um, when I was first learning emotions, which I was doing through Genling focusing,
Mm.
which is like this process of going, but I'm telling for the audience, you go into what your felt experience of something is. Um, and so you get a lot of information from, I like to think of it as like you're reaching into your subconscious and then pulling out like, oh, what do I actually feel about this thing, what is
Mm.
actually going on. And it's a step-by-step process, and so I was doing that, and like, coming from a rationalist point of view and like a kind of like slightly emotionally suppressed sort of person before, and then finding like, wow, I have all of these feelings and I can feel them in my body, and they're all so strong and big and everywhere. And it wasn't until I got Alexander technique that like there was a way that in order to find what the emotion was, I kind of intensified it to amplify the signal so that I could actually kind of go in and be like, oh, what is this?
Mm.
But it kind of got to the point where whenever I was doing focusing, the emotions would then become kind of overwhelming. Like it'd be like they would start taking over my experience, and then I wouldn't have a good way of dealing with them. And then the Alexander technique gave me the space, so like I can have all of that, and there's still all of the space.
Mm.
And what that did was allow me to embrace the intensity of the emotions, but not amplify it, like not need to create intensity, as Art of Accomplishment would say. um yeah, there was also a thing of like, uh so I've gone to Alexander Technique weekends, and I've had the worst week. Like it will be like incredibly stressful. I'll be like feeling like absolute garbage, and at one point I asked Peter, like I was feeling very stressed, and I asked, what do you do when you are feeling stressed? And so this is actually harder to do. It's harder to keep the space on what, because my mind keeps going to this thing that I'm stressed out about. And he said, well, there's the stress, there's that's happening, and also there's all of
Mm.
this.
Mm.
And and he often has quite bad side effects from his chemotherapy drugs, and so he can be nauseous and whatever, and so he has all of that nausea, and he
Mm.
still has the space, and that kind of makes it like it doesn't get rid of the stress or the nausea, but it does put it in context so that it's not sort of overwhelming, because like there are still like birds outside, there's still some
Mm.
lovely trees, I'm still talking to you, like there's still space behind my head, and all of this sort of thing, and so the size of the emotion compared with the rest of the like the physical size, like it just kind of feels like it's sort of less or contextualized.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. And Peter's expression, "there it is, and there's everything else," has been like an extremely powerful and useful thing for me to be playing with ever since I learned it. It's like, okay, I'm feeling bad. Yep, that I honor that. That's true. And right. Um, I think, as you're pointing to, the habit is always, I'm feeling bad, and everything collapses onto badness. And not only is your world suddenly very much smaller, but it's filled with bad at that point. Um, and it often gets stuck and can't express and move through and be allowed to do its thing and kind of convey its message almost and transform into something else.
Yeah, I think if I didn't have Alexander technique and the expanded awareness thing, having the doing the embrace intensity move would be confusing to me, because I
Mm.
would just be in like, oh, embrace, and like, oh no, now it's getting really big, and now it's like
Yes.
everything or something like this. Whereas this, it's almost like intensity is going to come to you, let it come to you, and like
Mm.
let whatever its thing is, like let that move through you, let that have the effect that it has.
And there's also then a follow-up move of remain unfixated even with the emotion. So like at any point, there's going to be a impulse to amplify, to do, to protect, to defend, to push around, whatever. And if you can keep noticing that you're about to do that and inhibit it, you can almost allow the emotion to flow in a channel that is not itself affecting the emotion in any way. You're just like an open channel for this thing, in a sense, like fully expressed, rather than
I'm
doing
not sure if
things
I
to
fully
it.
follow.
So
Like,
like,
what do you mean by the flow?
so let's say that, okay, example of anger again, because it's a strong emotion. Anger shows up, and at first I'm like, okay, I allow it. I'm going to like allow the intensity of this anger. But then 5 seconds later, it gets stronger, and I'm like, I still, I'm not liking this. Like, you have to keep asserting that, we don't have to, but like, the move to remain unfixated from the anger, which is one of, the anger is present, and I'm okay with that, as opposed to, the anger is here, and I have to do something with it, or something, or like I'm obligated to
Ah,
respond to it in any particular way, right?
the full state of embracing intensity is this extremely spontaneous, extremely non-doing,
Mm.
like things are happening, and I'm not planning it, and I'm not stopping it, and I'm not trying to get ahead of it. I'm
Mm.
just with it, and I'm just sort of being affected by it all through, like its ups and downs and changes and everything.
Exactly. And I think what AT gives is recognition of that as a dynamic process, in the sense of you have to keep choosing to not engage with it, to put down the responses to it, rather than allow once and then you're done, essentially. It's a kind of ongoing choosing.
There's a thing that I've heard recently, so about inhibition and the idea of your reactions to stuff,
Mm.
and like if you have reacted to something, then you didn't inhibit it. There's a kind of like, you can't, like, once that's already happening, then there's a way that like that was inevitable, like that
Mm-hmm.
was just what your system did.
Yeah.
And then there's this thing of you can only inhibit before you have the stimulus in the first place. Have you heard this? Does this sound
Uh,
familiar? Is this a standard AT thing, or is this what some people
I've
say?
I've not heard that specific framing. No. So even before
So
the
yeah,
stimulus shows up, that you're already inhibiting.
I think I went to a talk by Kingsley, and I think he said something like this, like once the because basically we respond to a stimulus however we are all to respond to that
Mm.
stimulus, and if you have a particular response to a particular stimulus, when that stimulus hits, that's the thing you're going to do. You
Mm.
can change your response, like all of your responses are kind of, it's always, and so it's something like you change how you think about the stimulus such that you have the freedom. But this needs to happen before the stimulus in the first place. And so he says inhibition, you can only do that before the stimulus hit. Like you can be in an inhibited state such that when the stimulus hits, then you're not like reacting to it in this sort of reactive way. And then, but I think I hear that there's some subtlety here, because Peter describes it as when an urge kind of like bubbles up, then you can inhibit that urge, and I think you also describe it that way. And I think they probably are the same thing, but it doesn't sound like they are the same thing, or possibly they are different. What do you think?
Without knowing exactly what Kingsley means, I think I understand the idea of inhibition being a thing that you're always doing, in some sense. Like, there's just like the Alexander thing contains an element of global inhibition, in a sense. And from that state, you can then apply it specifically to things that arise in the way that Peter means. So as something bubbles up, you can go like, oh, I'm about to, or I want to, or something, and you can go like, no. I think when you've tipped over into response, at that point, you have no free will, basically. You're just off in the track. And then you'll come to at some point like, oh, I just did the thing. The state before that is increasingly subtle, I think, as you get better at noticing the stimulus in the early stages of it. And if you're in global inhibition mode, then you're like, oh, there's a stimulus, and it seems like I haven't responded to it, kind of thing. It's not like you're constantly going stimulus, not responding. It's like I'm inhibiting globally, and then I appear to have not responded to this thing. How do I want to respond to it? And do I want to keep inhibiting that habitual response, or do I want to just go with it or choose something else or whatever?
Yeah, maybe it's like, so when you're in the state of inhibition or state of non-doing or whatever, you are, when urges come up, they are now a transformed stimulus. So it's not just like I have an urge and then I'm going to go do it. It's like I notice this urge, and like the urge plus noticing is a different stimulus from just the urge.
Yes, I think so.
Cool.
I think that this might be a good time to wrap this conversation and do a part 2 some other time, in part because it's getting very dark here, as you may have noticed, and I'm being blinded by my very crappy light. But I've enjoyed this immensely, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we can discuss in part 2. Before we close, where can people find you on the interwebs, should they have listened through to the end of this thing?
Yeah, so I'm mostly on Twitter at Reason is Fun. I also have another account at Meta Lulie. That's Meta with 1 T. Nice. And yeah, so Twitter, like Reason is Fun, is the best place to reach me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for spending like 2 hours of your time talking to me on this Not a Podcast. It's been great talking to you. And I think more broadly, I'd love to kind of keep talking about AT and Vue and other stuff just as it comes up. So let's like keep doing stuff like this, I think.
Yeah, and anyone listening to this, send in questions or comments or anything, and then we'll talk about those next time.
Awesome. Cool.
If
Thank
that's
you.
okay with you, I'm just like taking
yeah, please. questions, comments, all kinds of input are very welcome here, please.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, thanks.
Thanks a lot.